Hello, I'd like to get another sermon recorded on the book of Romans. If you'd like to follow along in your Bibles, which I always recommend, we're going to be covering Romans 4 verses 9 through 17. So that's Romans 4 verses 9 through 17. And we'll just begin by reading the passage and then go into an exposition of it. So, Romans 4, beginning at verse 9, where Paul writes, "Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. For he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise made of no effect, because the law brings about wrath. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations, in the presence of him whom he believed, God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did." So this is another difficult passage here, as you know, Paul writes some difficult things. And in the last message that we went over, that I recorded, it was on Romans 4 verses 1 through 8. And in that message, Paul was making the case of how we are not justified through works, okay? Just you know, what does he mean by that, by works? You know, he may have been referring specifically to works of the Mosaic Law when he uses that term. Or, you know, as I said when we were covering Romans 4 verses 1 through 8, he may have been specifically also referring to you know, works alone in general, godly works. You know, we're not justified by works alone either. But when we were discussing Romans 4 verses 1 through 8, you know, we noted that there were different categories of works discussed in the New Testament. You know, like I said, there's works of the Mosaic Law, and then there's godly works, whether those works are done before initial justification or whether those godly works are done afterwards. I like what Berceau had to say about the issue of works in general. He says, you know, to be sure, this is a quote, he says, to be sure, Paul dismissed works of the law. He's talking about works of the Mosaic Law. He said Paul dismissed them as having little value. However, Paul never attacks godly works, whether they are done before our initial salvation or after it. He only explains that we cannot be saved merely by doing good works. And in this lesson, in Romans 4, verses 9 through 17, Paul continues with the same theme. He's just going into a little more detail. He's being a little more specific. And Paul, in this passage that we're covering, Paul first shows that we're not justified by circumcision, and neither was Abraham. And he talks about that in verses 9 through 12. He's speaking of, who can receive this blessing? And I think he's talking about the blessing of forgiveness, the blessing of justification. In verses 9 and 10, Paul writes, "Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also?" And then Paul says, "For we say that," and this may be a quote here, what he says when he says, "For we say that faith is accounted, or faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness." So he says, "For we say that," and this may be a quote right here, "faith was accounted," and that word accounted is logizomai. It was accounted. It's the same word that's elsewhere translated as imputed. Here he uses the word accounted, but it's the Greek word logizomai. So it's faith, pistis, was accounted. It was credited. It was reckoned, considered, ascribed. It was accounted to Abraham for righteousness, or it was accounted as righteousness. And like I said, that may be a quote of Genesis 15, verse 6, when Paul says, "For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness." And then he asks in verse 10, "How then was it accounted? How then was it reckoned? How was it? How then, or when?" There's a couple of translations that say, "When was it counted?" When in his life? How was it accounted, or when was it credited or ascribed? He says, "While he was circumcised or uncircumcised." When was it? Was it accounted when he was circumcised or uncircumcised? He says, "Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised." So that's significant to the argument that Paul is building here. The argument that the Holy Spirit prompted him to put together. And so, but we notice because of this specific talk of circumcision, the issue of circumcision, I believe we can safely conclude that Paul's no longer talking about works in general. If that was ever his focus, he has come back to this specific target of circumcision, the issue of the Mosaic Law. He's talking about the case he's making about the equality of the Jews and Gentiles before God, their spiritual equality before God. And that's the focus of Romans. Paul had to deal with this specific practical issue of circumcision because some Jewish Christian men had been telling Gentile Christian men that unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And that's a quote from Acts chapter 15, verse 1. So the Holy Spirit prompted Paul to counter such false claims. And Paul then shows that this blessedness that he speaks of, the righteous standing, the clean slate, the forgiveness that was given to uncircumcised Abraham because of his faith in the promises of God. Paul showing that that's why it was given. The blessedness, the forgiveness, was given to uncircumcised Abraham. It was because of his faith. It wasn't because of his circumcision, because he hadn't been circumcised yet. It wasn't because he had been following the Mosaic Law, because the Mosaic Law hadn't come into being yet. Moses wasn't born yet. And so circumcision played no role in Abraham's initial justification. And so Paul is saying that Gentiles likewise can be saved initially. They can come in, they can receive forgiveness without being circumcised. And this teaching was not easy for Jewish ears to hear. It was not easy for them to accept this. They had a very high regard for circumcision. But the recorded facts in the Bible, it clearly shows that Abraham was justified 13 years or more before he was circumcised. When you compare Genesis 15:6 with Genesis 17:10 and verses 24 and 25. So Paul's saying that circumcision was not necessary for justification. That's his point. That's the point he's making. And then Paul continues in verse 11. And he, Abraham, he's talking about Abraham, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe. So he's saying, that Abraham received the sign of circumcision, which he calls a seal of the righteousness. It was a seal in the sense that circumcision authenticated his prior justification, the justification that he had before he was circumcised. He says it's a sign, it's a seal of the righteousness of the faith, of the pistis, which also carries a connotation of loyalty, allegiance, faithfulness, fidelity. It was a sign of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised. Paul says that Abraham might be the father, he's talking about the spiritual father, of all those who believe. All those who believe, it's a pistuo, it's an action verb, it's a continuous word there. He's the father of all those who are believing. You could say who are faithful. Though they are uncircumcised, Paul says, that Abraham is the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed, and that's that word logizomai, that righteousness might be accounted or reckoned or considered or ascribed to them also. It might be, righteousness might be accounted to the uncircumcised also, is what Paul is saying. So Paul seems to be saying here that circumcision is subordinate to the righteousness, the righteous standing that Abraham had received 13 years earlier while he was uncircumcised. The righteousness that he received due to his faith in God. So circumcision is a sign and a seal. These are outward marks. Circumcision, a sign and a seal of this righteousness. But circumcision itself is not righteousness. Paul's saying that such a righteous standing can be attained by faith, by pistis, without circumcision. So without faith, without faith and faithfulness, we should say, circumcision had no value. It was a sign and a seal of nothing, with no reality behind it. And so, likewise, without faith, it doesn't do any good to be uncircumcised either. Faith and faithfulness is what relates us to Abraham. I like this quote by John Chrysostom. He died at 407 AD. John Chrysostom says, "Abraham was justified and crowned while in uncircumcision. The Jews actually came along afterwards. Accordingly, Abraham was originally the father of the uncircumcised, those who are connected to him through faith. Later, he also became the father of those of the circumcision. He became the father of the Jews, basically, ethnic Jews. That came about later. He says, for he is the ancestor of two lines of people. People who are uncircumcised and people who are circumcised. That's from John Chrysostom. And then Paul speaks in verse 12. He's talking about, the necessity of following in Abraham's faith, following his example. In verse 12, Paul writes, and he's talking about Abraham. He's saying Abraham is the father of circumcision. I would say he's the spiritual father of, and that's a strange phrase to say he's the father of circumcision. If you look at other translations, it's basically saying he's the spiritual father of circumcised people or ethnic Jews. So it says, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision. He's saying to those who not only are Jews, not only to those who are Jewish, but also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. So, he's saying that basically Jews, Abraham's physical descendants, they can also follow Abraham's example of faith and be justified. But if people who are ethnic Jews, if they are only circumcised, if that's all they got going for them, if they are only circumcised, and if they fail to follow Abraham's example of faith, which includes faithfulness, then they're going to miss out on having this righteousness reckoned to them. They won't be spiritually related to Abraham, if that's all they have going for them. And Jesus taught the same thing. In John 8:39, Jesus told the Jews, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. And so Jesus is emphasizing that your ethnic descent, doesn't help you if you're not doing the works of Abraham. So Paul's saying, your circumcision doesn't help you if you're not walking in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. It only benefits us if we are doing the works of Abraham, as Jesus said. In 1 Corinthians 7:19, Paul wrote the following. He says, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. So, that's what Paul is teaching here. Paul was not teaching that our works don't matter. He's teaching the opposite. But the days of men needing visible bodily signs, they're gone. What's needed is faith and faithfulness. After our initial justification, we must live out our faith. Walking as obedient children of God, continuously walking in harmony with Abraham's example. And like I said, Abraham died before the Mosaic Law was even instituted. Just as Abraham ventured out in faith and was willing to undergo hardships because of his faith, we too, we must be willing to do the same. So, justification by faith, it doesn't imply easy believism or faith only, as many people imagine. You know, when Paul speaks of walking in the steps of the faith, you know, the steps, the word steps is plural. The steps of Abraham's faith, it indicates that his faith continued over the years. And his faith actually started before his circumcision. So righteousness, forgiveness, justification, it was ascribed by God to Abraham after Abraham had demonstrated his faith in some actions, you know, more than one, and after he had done it over some time. And then in verses 13 through 15, in Romans, it's where we're at, Romans 4, verses 13 through 15 in our progress. You know, Paul's teaching here that we're not justified by keeping the Mosaic Law, and neither was Abraham. You know, Paul's just repeating himself here. And so Paul says in verses 13 and 14, basically, that the promised inheritance comes through faith. It comes through pistis. In verses 13 and 14, Paul wrote, "For the promise that Abraham would be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law," and he's talking about the Mosaic Law, "but through the righteousness of faith," through the righteousness of pistis. In verse 14 he says, "For if," and a lot of translations say, "for if only," for if, or if only, those who are of the law, of the Mosaic Law, are heirs. Paul says, faith, pistis, or which has the idea of faithfulness, faith is made void, and the promise is made of no effect. Origen, he lived like from 185 to 253. Origen said that this promise that God made, that Abraham would be heir of the world, he said it means that Abraham would receive the entire earth as an inheritance through his descendants. You know, it's not just talking about his physical descendants, but spiritual descendants as well. But in Genesis 12:3, 12:3b, God promised Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So if this promise had been limited to only those who had followed the Mosaic Law, you know, then God's promise would have failed, or it would have been seriously modified. You know, Abraham himself, as I've said, did not live by the Mosaic Law. When God made his promises to Abraham, which he made a series of them in Genesis 12:3, Genesis 15 verses 5 and 6, Genesis 18:18, Genesis 22:18, when he made these promises to Abraham, nothing was said about the Mosaic Law. You know, it didn't exist. It didn't exist till Moses was an old man. And so when God brought salvation to the Gentiles, he was fulfilling his promises to Abraham. You know, God wasn't violating his promise. As a man named, an early Christian writer named Theodoret, he's writing, he lived from like 393 to 466, so he's probably writing it in the 400s here. He says, "If only those who live according to the law," he's talking about the Mosaic Law, "if only those who live according to the law obtain the promised blessings, Abraham believed God in vain. The promises God made to him were not true, but false." And so it is through Abraham's spiritual descendants, through Christians, including including faithful Gentiles, it's through us that Abraham will be heir of the world, and heir of the new earth as well. But these promises that God made to Abraham and his spiritual offspring, it's important to know that these promises are conditional. They're conditional on faith. They're conditional on pistis, which, like I said, it carries the connotation of fidelity, of loyalty, of allegiance, of faithfulness. You know, we don't want to misunderstand what Paul's saying here, which has been done, unfortunately. You know, Paul was no antinomian. He was not against the idea of law. Although he does say in verse 15, he says that the law brings wrath. In verse 15 he says, because the law, he's talking about the Mosaic Law, the law brings about wrath. For where there is no law, there is no transgression. And I think that second time he uses the word law in that verse, I think it should be understood with a small l. You know, the first time in that verse, I think it's capital L, referring to the Mosaic Law. The second time in verse 15, when the word law is used, I think it should be understood with a small l. But, you know, normally the Mosaic Law brought wrath to people in the sense of punishment. You know, it prescribed specific punishments when they broke the Mosaic Law, whether it was fines or being flogged or being stoned to death, whatever. You know, those punishments were prescribed when it was broken. But because the Gentiles, you know, they were not subject to the Mosaic Law, they were not under the law of Moses, they were not subject to these temporal punishments either. You know, they were not subject to being fines and flogged and stoned to death because they broke the law, because they weren't under the law. So in this sense, Gentiles had it, they had it a little easier. So, you know, maybe Paul is hinting that the Jews should be happy that the Mosaic Law was no longer in effect, and that they now stood on equal ground with the Gentiles. But in verse 15, in Romans 4:15, the second part of the verse, you know, where it says, "For where there is no law, there is no transgression," is that part of the verse, is that suggesting that Gentiles were not guilty of sin because they were not under the Mosaic Law? Is that what that's saying? No, that's not what that's saying. You know, Paul taught in Romans chapters 1 and 2 that Gentiles were guilty of sin for violating what they knew to be right, you know, according to God's natural law, God's implanted natural law. You know, God had other laws. He had laws other than the Mosaic Law. There was the natural law that Paul spoke of in chapters 1 and 2. Also, you know, Jesus is the new lawgiver. So we're not lawless, but so I don't think that's what Paul is saying in the second half of verse 15. No one who has reached the age of accountability anyway is really exempt from the possibility of receiving God's wrath. And you know, Paul says something similar to Romans 4:15b, you know, where he says, "For where there is no law, there is no transgression." He says something similar to that in Romans 5, verse 13, part B. He says, "Sin is not imputed when there is no law." And you know, at least there he may be referring to the time to the time period before a person comes to the age of accountability. Anyway, so we are justified by faith. That's true. We are justified by faith. That's Paul's teaching here. We're justified by faith as was Abraham. In chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, to continue on, Paul says that the promise also depends on faith. In verse 16, Paul says, "Therefore it is of faith, that it might be according to grace," you know, and that might mean gift, that might be according to grace, "so that the promise might be sure," that the promise might be, the Greek word there means it might be so that it might be firm, reliable, dependable. Paul says, "to all the seed." And he's talking about you know, spiritual descendants of Abraham. He says, not only to those who are of the law, who are of the Mosaic Law, not only to those, not only to Jews who are following the Mosaic Law, that's what Paul's saying. He says, but also to those who are of the faith, who are of the pistis of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So Paul's saying, in verse 16, it is of faith, or it is by faith. But as far as what exactly it refers to, and Paul uses that word, what exactly does it refer to? That's the question. Does it refer to justification and the blessedness of being forgiven? Or does it refer to the promise of being heir of the world? Paul, has talked about both things here in chapter 3 and in chapter 4. So, I'm not entirely for sure about which understanding is correct. Maybe both. But God had always intended to make the blessings of Abraham available to the entire world, and to give this blessing of justification, the blessing of forgiveness, as a gift to all who share in the faith, in the pistis of Abraham. And this, it has to be a gift, because at the end of the day, the only thing any of us really deserve is hell, because all have sinned. Or all who have reached the age of accountability, the Bible teaches, all have sinned. So, if the blessings of Abraham were only given to those who had always faithfully kept the Mosaic Law, then it would not be a gift, nor would it be a general blessing. It wouldn't be a general blessing that's extended to all of mankind. It would have only been available to consistently faithful Jews, or we could say Israelites who lived under the Mosaic Law. That's the only people who would have been open to receiving this blessing. Gentiles would have been nearly without hope. But Paul says that the blessing of justification is gifted to all who exercise the faith of Abraham, and who then walk in his steps, and walking in the steps of faithful Abraham. Theodoret, he lived I think I've quoted him, yeah, I did. So he's writing in probably about the 400s. Theodoret wrote this. He says, Paul silences the arrogance of the Jews by applying the term seed of Abraham to those who imitate the faith of Abraham, regardless of how distant they may be from him regarding blood kinship. While the law, he's talking about the Mosaic Law, while the law punishes transgressors, grace provides forgiveness of sins. Grace thereby confirms the promise made by God by bringing that blessing on all nations. Paul has called Abraham the father of both the Gentiles and the Jews. So this is what Paul is teaching here. And Paul continues in verse 17, where he wrote, as it is written, and he's going to quote here from Genesis 17:5. As it is written, I have made you a father of many nations. In the presence of him, he's saying, in the presence of God, and in the sight of God, whom he, Abraham, believed. God, who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist, which do not yet exist, he calls those things as though they did. So here in verse 17, Paul quotes from Genesis 17:5, and he shows that Abraham was not just the father of Israel, but he's the father of many nations, in the spiritual sense, by way of faith. God promised this to Abraham when Abraham an old man. It was made. This promise was made a year or so before Isaac was even born. So, yet God speaks as though it's already done. He says, "I have made you a father of many nations." I have already basically made you a father of many nations, even though he wasn't yet. His son Isaac hadn't been born yet. So Abraham, when God gave him his promise, he believed God. He trusted in God's promise, and therefore he was justified in God's sight, just as Gentiles can also be. That's the connection that Paul is drawing here. And concerning this idea of giving life to the dead, is spoken of in verse 17. God is not only able to literally raise people from the dead and make them whole again, but he gives life in other ways too. Think of Abraham. Abraham was said to be as good as dead. Sarah's womb was dead. She was barren. But yet God rejuvenated them. He quickened them so that they could reproduce. And this was why Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. He thought that God could raise Isaac from the dead. And God also gives life to those who are spiritually dead as well. And when Paul says here in verse 17 that God calls those things which do not exist as though they did, this is most likely referring to the numerous offspring of Abraham that did not yet exist. And that's not just talking about his physical descendants, but his spiritual descendants as well, including the Gentiles who would be grafted in by faith. So God knew in advance, and he spoke in advance of what his larger plans would be concerning how he would fulfill this promise to Abraham. So in conclusion, Paul has taught that Abraham is the father of all who believe. He's not just the father of those who have been circumcised and who follow the Mosaic Law. And Paul's saying that we become related to Abraham by sharing in the same sort of faith in God that he had, a faithful faith. Paul taught, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul taught this doctrine, I guess we could say. He taught it so that the Jewish Christians who felt inclined to Judaize the Gentile Christians, so they would stop doing it. They would stop telling people that you have to be circumcised, that you have to follow the Mosaic Law to be saved. That's why he's teaching this. He's teaching it so that Jewish Christians would get over it, and that they might understand that the promises of God would still be theirs, even if they were to stop following the Mosaic Law. So as long as they continued to believe and to obey like Abraham did, who lived before the Mosaic Law. But let's not fall into the trap of believing that God somehow considers baptized Christians to be righteous, even though they are not walking in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while he was still uncircumcised. When we initially consecrate ourselves to Jesus, God truly gives us a righteous standing. But after we have received the clean slate, God calls us to move on from this state of possessing what many people consider to be a fictional righteousness, and as if righteousness. We have to move on from that, from being just forgiven. And we have to begin to be righteous and be holy in all of our conduct, being blameless and holy in body and spirit. But if you think that God will continue to view sinning Christians as righteous. You know, if you think that God's going to view Christians who are just continuing on in sin, if you think God's going to view them as though they're not living in sin, then you've been deceived by a doctrine of demons. You know, just consider what Paul wrote elsewhere, such as in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. He clears that up when he says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous," he's talking about the practically unrighteous people, he says, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God?" That's pretty plain. "Do not be deceived." A lot of people are. "Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God." He's making a very blunt, bold statement that cannot be misunderstood here. So, you know, we have to consider what Paul wrote elsewhere. If you start to get a little confused about what he wrote in Romans 3 and 4, you look at what he said elsewhere. You know, he's not saying that we can just continue in sin and be okay. You know, just because we might happen to, you know, hold to some, you know, intellectually hold to some truths about God. And I think he wrote Hebrews. In Hebrews 12:14, it says, "Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord." So without holiness, no one will see the Lord. So if you depend on Martin Luther's analogy of Christians as being snow-covered piles of dung, you know, as if God's or Jesus's imputed righteousness covers you, who you're actually a pile of poop, that Jesus's righteousness covers you as snow so that God doesn't even see your sin. Well, you know, if you continue to live in sin, just consider that the Bible teaches, I think, that snow is going to melt, and God is going to see you as you are. And of course, God does see our sin. He does see us as we truly are. In Hebrews 4:13, Paul says, "And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." So, you know, don't be deceived by this false doctrine that Jesus' righteousness has been imputed to our account and covers us like a robe, and so it just covers us so God doesn't see our sin even though we're continuing to live in it. No, that is a doctrine of the devil. Do not be deceived. Sinners go to hell, saints go to heaven. God bless.